They said he was digging his own grave. That's what it looked like from the road anyway. While the rest of the valley was busy stacking hay, sealing shutters, and hauling the last wagon loads of firewood before the first hard freeze, Caleb Morgan was knee-deep in a trench that ran from the back of his cabin toward the tree line. It wasn't straight, it wasn't wide, and it certainly wasn't practical, at least not in any way his neighbors could understand. From above, it looked like a scar across the earth. From the ground, it looked like madness. "Man's finally cracked," someone muttered at the general store. "Winter's coming and he's digging sideways instead of stacking up," another laughed. The trench stretched nearly 30 yards from the rear of his cabin to a low rise near the edge of his property where his woodshed stood. But instead of leaving it open, Caleb began lining it with rough-cut boards, reinforcing the sides with split logs and shaping the top with curved timbers bent into shallow arches. And then came the strangest part. He covered it. Layer by layer, first planks, then tarred canvas, then a thick packing of dirt and sod, cut from his own field, laid back over the top like he was burying something he never intended to retrieve. By late October, only a low hump of earth marked where the trench had been. It looked like a burial mound, stretching between his house and shed. And that's when the jokes grew sharper. He's afraid of the snow now? Building a tunnel for moles? Or maybe he plans to hibernate? Caleb said nothing. He worked in silence, checking seams, packing soil tight, reinforcing the entry near his cabin with a short wooden doorway that descended 2 steps below ground level before curving forward into darkness. To anyone watching, it seemed absurd. The distance between his house and woodshed was barely 30 paces. A healthy man could walk it in less than a minute. Why spend weeks digging when boots already worked fine? Because Caleb wasn't solving for October, he was solving for January. He had lived through enough winters in that valley to understand something the others never quite admitted. It wasn't the snowfall that killed you, it was the wind that followed. Snow piled high, yes, but wind packed it into walls so dense they might as well have been stone. It found the gaps in wood piles. It drove powder into cracks where it melted by day and froze by night. It stole heat every time a door opened, and most importantly, it exhausted you. Every trip to the woodshed cost strength. Every step through waist-deep drifts drained calories. Every blast of air that entered the cabin when the door swung open forced the stove to fight harder, burning more fuel just to reclaim lost ground. Most men accepted that as winter. Caleb calculated it as loss. The previous February, after 3 weeks of relentless storms, he had nearly run out of seasoned wood, not because he lacked supply, because half of it had frozen solid under layers of melt and freeze cycles caused by heat leaking from his cabin wall. He had spent days chopping ice off logs. He had burned damp wood that hissed and spat more steam than flame. He had watched frost creep across his interior walls and wondered how long before strength failed. He survived. But survival felt too close to chance. So, when spring came, he began measuring. Distance from house to shed, average snowfall depth, prevailing wind direction. He noticed that drifts always formed in a crescent shape between the 2 buildings. He noticed that once snow packed high enough, opening the back door created a pressure difference that sucked powder directly inside. He noticed patterns, and patterns can be engineered around. The tunnel wasn't for hiding, it was for separation. By running the passage below ground level and covering it with earth, he created a stable air corridor, shielded from wind, insulated by soil, protected from drifting snow. Underground temperatures fluctuate far less than surface air. Even when the world above plunged to 30 below, the earth just 2 feet down remained significantly warmer. Not warm, but stable. Stable air doesn't create condensation shock. Stable air doesn't freeze wood solid. Stable air doesn't steal heat in violent bursts. The others didn't see that. They saw dirt. They saw wasted labor. They saw a man digging sideways when he should have been stacking upward. By early November, frost hardened the soil again, sealing the sod cap over his tunnel like armor. Caleb installed a simple wooden hatch at the shed end and reinforced the cabin entry with thick, overlapping boards. Inside the passage, he placed flat stones along the floor to prevent mud during thaw, and hung a small oil lantern hook midway down. The first time he walked its length, he did so slowly, listening. Above him, wind brushed across grass. Inside, silence. The air felt cool, steady, unmoving, exactly what he wanted. By mid-November, snow began falling lightly. Nothing dramatic, just enough to coat roofs and soften fence lines. Neighbors continued their routines. Wood stacked high against cabin walls under extended eaves. Paths shoveled between doorways. Confidence intact. Then, one evening in early December, the sky shifted. Clouds didn't build gradually, they thickened. A heavy grey ceiling dropped low over the valley, swallowing the ridgeline. The air grew still. Too still. Men who had seen enough winters recognized that silence. It wasn't peace, it was pressure. Caleb checked his hatch doors one last time, sealed tight. He carried an armload of wood through the tunnel, lit his stove, and sat quietly while the first flakes began falling. Across the valley, laughter still echoed from one porch where someone pointed toward the slight mound in his yard and joked about buried treasure. By morning, no one was laughing. Snow did not drift gently. It drove sideways in white sheets, piling high in hours. Wind screamed down from the mountains, flattening fences and turning open ground into a blur of ice crystals. By nightfall, the valley had disappeared. Cabin doors opened to walls of white, paths vanished, and drifts climbed so high against buildings that windows at ground level became skylights of ice. Men fought their way to woodpiles, only to find them crusted in frozen glaze. Heat, escaping from cabin walls, had melted snow against the stacks, which then refroze harder than before. Axes rang against ice instead of timber. Logs came free, soaked and useless. Inside those cabins, stoves worked overtime, evaporating moisture rather than heating rooms. Fuel consumption doubled, strength halved, and every trip outside cost more than the last. Meanwhile, beneath the snow-covered mound behind his cabin, Caleb lifted his hatch and stepped downward. No wind, no drifting powder, just the muted sound of storm above thick earth. He walked the tunnel in steady silence to his shed. The wood inside remained dry, untouched by melt cycles or swirling snow. The earth overhead absorbed wind force. The temperature difference between cabin and tunnel was gradual, not violent. He carried back exactly what he needed, closed the hatch, fed the stove. While the storm raged above like a freight train of ice, Caleb's world remained contained, not warm enough to boast about, but stable enough to live. And as the blizzard deepened into something far worse than forecast, one truth became unavoidable. The valley had buried itself. Except for the man they said was digging his own grave. Would you have spent weeks digging when everyone else laughed? Or would you have trusted that boots and tradition were enough? Let me know what you think below. The storm did not pass in a day, or two. It settled over the valley like a lid. By the third morning, fences were gone. Not broken, gone. Buried so completely that only the tops of a few stubborn posts showed like crooked teeth through the white. Barn doors were half swallowed. Windows at ground level were pressed solid with packed snow. Men who had lived their entire lives in that valley had never seen accumulation like this. They opened their back doors expecting a path. They found a wall. The first real problem wasn't cold, it was access. To reach the woodshed, most families had to carve tunnels of their own through drifts that reached chest height. Snow wasn't powder anymore. Wind had compacted it into heavy slabs that required shovels and axes to break through. Each step forward demanded strength, and every time they finally reached their woodpile, they found something worse. The piles, stacked neatly against cabin walls, had become frozen monuments. The heat leaking from inside the house had melted the inner layer of snow pressing against the logs during the brief daylight hours. At night, when temperatures plunged below 30 under zero, that moisture turned to glass. The outer logs were fused together in solid sheets of ice. Men hacked desperately. Each swing of an axe echoed dull and unforgiving. When they managed to pry loose a single log, it was wet through the grain. Back inside, the stove spent more energy boiling water from that wood than producing heat. Flames sputtered, smoke thickened, chimneys struggled to draft. Inside those cabins, frost crept along interior walls. Blankets multiplied. Children sat near stoves that roared but did not truly warm. Fuel vanished faster than planned. Across the valley, frustration grew louder than the wind. Up on Caleb Morgan's property, the world above ground looked no different. His cabin was nearly buried on the north side. Snow pressed high against the shed door. But beneath that smooth white mound, something else existed. On the fourth morning of the storm, Caleb opened his inner hatch and descended 2 steps into the tunnel. The difference was immediate. Sound changed first. Above ground, wind screamed like something alive. Inside the tunnel, it became a distant, muffled rumble, present but powerless. Light dimmed to the soft amber of the lantern he carried. The air was cool but steady, no biting gust, no swirling powder, just the faint scent of earth and wood. He walked the length of the passage without leaning into wind, without shielding his face. At the shed end, he lifted the outer hatch, which opened inward into the protected shed interior. Snow had piled high outside the shed walls, but it had not forced its way inside. The roofline had been cleared before the storm, and the structure remained intact. Most importantly, the wood was dry, not because it was warmer, because it was isolated. The tunnel created a transition zone. The temperature shift from cabin warmth to outdoor freeze occurred gradually, not violently. Moisture did not condense and freeze in layers. Snow could not drift into the passage because wind never reached it. Caleb selected seasoned oak, crisp and resonant when tapped together. He returned through the tunnel, closed both hatches carefully, and fed his stove. The wood caught immediately. Flame bloomed bright and clean, no hissing, no smoke fighting to escape. He adjusted the damper and sat back, listening to the storm rage above earth that absorbed most of its fury. By the 6th day, the valley was exhausted. Men who had laughed at the dirt mound were now spending hours just reaching their wood each morning. Calorie reserves dropped, fingers stiffened. One man split his glove on frozen bark and lost feeling in 2 fingertips before he noticed. Inside their cabins, fires burned hotter than necessary simply to compensate for door openings and wet fuel. Heat rose, doors opened, heat fled, the cycle tightened. Caleb's routine barely changed. He burned only what he needed. Because he never had to battle wind to retrieve it, because his wood never froze solid, because his cabin door never opened directly into a blizzard. The tunnel absorbed that shock. On the 7th night, the wind intensified, not snow this time, just raw force. Gusts hammered cabins broadside, searching for weaknesses. Rooflines moaned, chimneys whistled. Pressure differences built between windward and leeward walls, forcing air through cracks in logs and chinking. In houses without buffers, smoke reversed in flues. Stoves struggled. Caleb noticed the change immediately, not because his cabin shook, but because it didn't. The earth above his tunnel flattened the wind's edge. Air moving over the mound followed the curve and continued onward. There were no flat surfaces for gusts to slam against, no exposed corners to accumulate drifts. The hatch doors trembled slightly, nothing more. On the 9th morning, someone attempted the climb up his property. He saw the movement through a small cleared slit in his window, a figure waist-deep in snow, fighting wind. Caleb waited. When the knock came, it was weak. He did not open his main door. He stepped into the tunnel first, closed the inner hatch behind him. then opened the outer hatch at the cabin entry and pulled the man inside. It was Thomas Briggs. His beard was crusted white, his eyes looked smaller somehow, set deeper from fatigue. "I need to see what you built," Thomas said without greeting. Caleb nodded and handed him the lantern. Thomas descended slowly, ducking beneath the curved roofline. They walked the tunnel together. Thomas ran his gloved hand along the packed earth ceiling, feeling its firmness. "It's warmer down here," he muttered. "Not warmer," Caleb corrected. "Less change." They reached the shed. Thomas stared at the woodpile, dry, stacked, untouched by ice. "You haven't had to dig?" he asked. "No." "You haven't lost any to freezing?" "No." Thomas exhaled slowly. "We're burning twice what we planned," he admitted. "Half of it just to dry the logs enough to light." Caleb studied him for a long moment. "The storm won't last forever," he said, "but the damage from fighting it will." Thomas understood. It wasn't just about surviving this week. It was about stretching supply for the weeks after. When Thomas left, he didn't laugh. He didn't even speak. By the 10th day, more men made the climb, some out of curiosity, some out of desperation. They crawled into the tunnel one by one, examining it like a miner inspecting a vein of gold. They felt the difference, the stillness, the absence of chaos. They saw that it wasn't elaborate engineering, just earth, wood, angle, separation. One man shook his head. "We mocked you for burying your yard," he said quietly. Caleb shrugged. "I buried my problem," he replied. Above ground, the storm began to weaken, not dramatically, just gradually. Snowfall slowed, wind softened, but the valley had already paid its price. Wood piles were half gone, men were tired, supplies meant to last until March were now calculated against February. Caleb's ledger told a different story. Usage down, reserves intact, strength conserved. The tunnel hadn't made winter disappear, it had reduced friction, and friction, over time, is what consumes you. On the 12th day, sunlight broke through clouds for the first time. It revealed a landscape reshaped. Drifts stood like frozen waves between cabins. Paths carved by desperate shoveling zigzagged across the valley floor. Chimneys smoked weakly from homes that had burned too hard for too long. Caleb emerged from his cabin and climbed onto the mound above his tunnel. He stood there quietly. The earth cap was solid. Snow slid gently down its curve. Below his boots lay the passage that had made all the difference. By afternoon, 3 men were measuring the distance from their own back doors to sheds. Not to mock, to calculate. The storm had buried nearly everything else, paths, fences, confidence. But the tunnel remained. And as February loomed, one truth settled across the valley, heavier than the snow itself. Winter wasn't defeated in a single night. It was negotiated daily. And those who reduced their daily losses would still be standing when the thaw finally came. The question was no longer whether Caleb had been foolish. The question was how quickly the rest of them could dig. When the sky finally cleared, it did not bring relief. It brought reckoning. Sunlight revealed what the storm had truly done. Snow lay in hardened ridges across the valley, some drifts taller than a man. Barn roofs sagged under weight. Fences were gone entirely in places. The main road had vanished beneath a white plain, so smooth it looked untouched by human life. The storm had passed. The consequences had not. Families emerged from their cabins thinner than they had been 2 weeks earlier, faces pale from smoke and poor sleep, movements slower, conversations quieter. Woodpiles told the story without exaggeration. Stacks meant to last until spring were already reduced to half or worse. Some households had begun cutting green timber out of desperation. Others rationed heat at night, sleeping in coats and waking with frost along interior walls. What had felt like a single storm now stretched into a longer fear. February was still ahead, and February had a reputation. Up on the ridge, Caleb Morgan stepped through his hatch and into the open air for the first time in days. The mound over his tunnel was smooth and firm. Snow had slid from its curved back, leaving only a shallow layer along the top. He brushed it away with his glove and inspected the seams. No sagging, no collapse, no drift forcing entry points. He climbed down and opened the cabin door. The temperature inside remained steady. The stove burned clean, no frantic roaring flame, no desperate overfeeding. He had burned less wood during the blizzard than he had during an ordinary windy week the year before. Less effort, less strain. That was the difference. By midday, the first visitor returned, not to inspect, to admit. Thomas Briggs removed his hat and stood on Caleb's porch in full daylight, not hiding his purpose now. "I've got 6 weeks of winter left," he said plainly. 3 weeks of dry wood. Caleb nodded. "You lost half during the storm," he said. Thomas didn't argue. "Couldn't keep it dry. Every log felt like it came out of a river." Caleb gestured toward the mound behind the cabin. "It's not about keeping snow off," he said. "It's about stopping air from changing too fast." Thomas had heard the explanation before. Now he understood it. "Help me plan it," he said quietly. That afternoon, they walked the distance from Thomas's back door to his shed. Snow still waist-deep in places. Wind cutting across open space. Caleb measured with boot strides, marked a path along the natural low ground where drifts formed less severely, explained how the earth itself was insulation if used properly. "You don't need stone," he said. "You need shape." By the end of the week, 2 more men were digging, not as deep, not as clean, but digging. It wasn't easy work. The ground beneath the snow was iron-hard from deep freeze. They had to chip through frost layer by layer. Hands blistered despite gloves. Progress was slow, but no one laughed this time, because every swing of the shovel was measured against wood remaining in the shed. By mid-February, crude versions of Caleb's tunnel began appearing across the valley. Some barely more than trenches lined with scrap boards and covered with doors pulled from unused sheds. Others were simply snow-packed corridors, reinforced with tarps to block wind. None were perfect, but perfection wasn't required. Stability was. One night, a second cold wave descended. Not a storm, just deep, relentless cold again. -28, -32, -35 in the low ground. Cabins without buffers felt the blow immediately. Doors opened and heat vanished like breath in the air. Cabins with even the simplest tunnel felt something different. Less shock, less howl, less panic. Wood consumption slowed. Not dramatically, but enough. And enough is everything when supply runs thin. Caleb walked his tunnel as usual, lantern swinging softly in hand. The air inside was cool but tolerable. Earth walls held steady, no ice glazing the boards, no drift pressing inward. He realized something important then. The tunnel wasn't just protecting wood, it was protecting him. Every trip outside during deep cold steals strength. Muscles tighten, lungs burn, fingers numb. Over weeks, that loss compounds into weakness. The tunnel removed that tax. He spent winter living, others spent winter fighting. By the final week of February, the valley felt stretched thin, but not broken. Wood piles were low, but not gone. Children slept closer to stoves, but not in desperation. The crude tunnels worked just enough to stabilize the last stretch. When March finally arrived and the sun lingered longer each afternoon, snow softened along fence lines. Roof edges dripped faintly. The world did not transform overnight, but something shifted. Hope returned quietly, and along with it came realization. The valley had not survived because winter was kind. It survived because losses were reduced early enough. On a mild afternoon, Martin Hale climbed the ridge to Caleb's cabin. He stood beside the mound and tapped it with his boot. "You weren't digging a grave," he said. Caleb smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I was digging time." Martin looked out across the valley at the other mounds now visible between houses. "Next year," he said slowly. "We start in August." Caleb nodded. Because the lesson wasn't about tunnels, it was about timing. Build before the sky turns grey, shape before the ground freezes, reduce loss before loss compounds. Spring would come fully soon. Grass would push through thawed soil, snow would retreat into shaded corners. But no one in that valley would ever again see a trench and assume foolishness. Because when the snow buried everything else, the only path that remained clear was the one built below the surface. And now the question wasn't whether digging had been madness, it was whether anyone would ever wait that long again. Would you have dug before the first snow, or waited until the shovel struck frozen ground? Tell me what you would have done. The thaw did not come gently, it came with weight. Snow that had ruled the valley for weeks began to collapse into itself. Drifts shrank from towering walls into sagging heaps. Packed paths dissolved into brown rivers of slush. The silence that once felt deadly was replaced by the steady sound of dripping water and distant creaks as roofs released their burden. And with the thaw came truth. Cabins that had fought the storm the hardest looked the worst. Woodpiles were reduced to ragged stumps. Fence rails were missing. One family had dismantled part of their own porch for fuel. Chimneys were stained thick with soot from fires burned too hot for too long. Exhaustion lingered on faces. The valley had survived, but barely. Up on the ridge, Caleb Morgan stood beside the low mound that had carried him through the worst of it. Snow had melted unevenly along its curve, revealing packed earth beneath. He lifted the hatch and walked the tunnel one last time for the season. The air inside was damp now from thaw, but intact. The structure had held, the boards were firm, the earth roof had not collapsed. At the shed, half his woodpile remained, not untouched, but present. That difference mattered more than pride. By late March, neighbors began dismantling their temporary tunnels. Some collapsed once the snow softened, others were carefully uncovered, studied, and rebuilt stronger for the following year. What began as desperation became design. Men who once mocked the trench now debated roof angles and ventilation gaps. They compared depths. They argued over the best distance between door and shed. They spoke in practical tones, not laughter. The valley had changed, not because winter had grown harsher, because they had grown observant. One afternoon, a small group gathered at Caleb's property. No one came to apologize. No one needed to. They came with measurements. "How deep did you dig?" Thomas asked. "Just below the frost line," Caleb replied. "How thick's the earth above?" "Enough to block wind, not so much it caves." Martin Hale studied the mound carefully. "Wind slides off it," he muttered. "Nothing for it to grab." Caleb nodded. "Flat walls fight wind, curves guide it." It wasn't complicated. That was the uncomfortable part. The tunnel hadn't required rare tools. It hadn't required expensive materials. It required attention. Attention to drift patterns, attention to wind direction, attention to the invisible cost of opening a door in deep winter. The valley had learned that lesson in hunger and smoke, and it would not forget it. By April, green shoots began breaking through thawed ground. Livestock returned to open pasture. The crisis faded into memory, replaced by the familiar rhythms of planting and repair. But one detail lingered. Between nearly every cabin and woodshed, stakes marked future paths. They would dig again, not in panic, not in ridicule, but in preparation. The following autumn arrived sooner than expected. Leaves browned, air sharpened, the same metallic scent crept across the valley, warning of what would come. This time, when shovels struck soil in August, no one laughed. Children carried boards, men bent timbers, women sealed seams with tar and cloth. Low, earth-covered humps began appearing across properties like quiet promises. And when the first heavy snow finally rolled down from the mountains, burying fence lines and swallowing roads once more, something remarkable happened. No frantic hacking at frozen wood, no smoke-choked cabins, no desperate burning of furniture. Men stepped down into protected corridors. They walked steady, sheltered paths to their sheds. They burned dry wood. They closed doors without losing half their warmth. Winter still came, but it no longer conquered. The valley had not defeated the cold, it had reduced the waste. And sometimes that is the only victory available. Years later, travelers passing through would notice the unusual mounds linking homes to sheds and ask why the valley built below ground. The answer was simple: because one winter the snow buried everything else, except the path built in advance. So when you see someone preparing in a way that looks unnecessary, when effort seems misplaced, when labor appears foolish against clear skies, ask yourself something. Are they digging a grave, or are they digging time? And if the storm were coming tomorrow, would you start digging today? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.